I am recording today's session. To start with, I've talked with several people as we're getting started, and it seems like we have a more experienced group than usual today. So I'm going to dive in and demonstrate how Transana works and how to work with a little bit of data. I encourage people to chime in with questions as we go. I find that even though it makes things maybe not flow quite as smoothly, I think it's a better experience overall. And the webinar hits the points that people need it to hit better if people do interrupt me with questions. So you can type questions into the chat, or you can just unmute your microphone and go ahead and ask. There's also a way of what Zoom calls raising your hand, which is a way to get my attention if you have a question as well. So you're welcome to do any of those things to be able to get my attention and get me to answer questions as we go. So we have a lot to cover, and I'm not going to get to everything. I'm going to move a little bit quickly. That's just kind of the nature of this webinar, but do slow me down with specifics as we go. If you hear strange noises coming through occasionally, my cat seems to be obsessed with rubbing itself on the microphone today, which is always fun. Okay, so what you can see on your screens right now is what Transana looks like when you first start it up. I've got a sample data set in here because that's helpful to be able to answer questions that come up sometimes and to demonstrate different features of the program. But I'm essentially going to start from scratch, and I'm going to bring in some data. I'm going to show you how to use automated transcription to get a first draft transcript of that data. We're going to start analysis on that data, do a couple of things that demonstrate parts of doing analysis within Transana. Then we'll look at Transana's reports and the other features that allow you to make sense out of the data that you have put in and started your analysis with. And as I say, questions as we go, but I'm also happy to stay and take questions as long as people have them at the end. So if you have a question that doesn't quite seem to fit into what I'm talking about, by all means, hang around afterwards and I'll get to that. Okay, so Transana's basic screen. Let me just load a sample.
This is the core they started with, and they want it to look like that. I'm going to first flip it up. Watch what happens.
So this obviously is an example of working with video data. Transana works with plain text, it works with PDFs, it works with video data, it works with audio data, it works with, if you do online surveys, you can bring that data into Transana and use it to analyze your open-ended question. Works with a variety of different data types. I'm going to focus mostly on video. Partly that's where Transana got its start, and partly that's what differentiates Transana from most of the other software in the field. But I will hit upon other data types as well. You can see that in the upper right-hand corner, you can see the video that you're working with. It's got the scroll bar so that you can scroll through and all of that. It works pretty much as you expect. In the upper left-hand side, you can see we have a waveform diagram that gives us information about the audio track. Transana can also show information about coding in that window to give you further information about what about your data and about your analysis. Below that, the lower left-hand corner, we have the document window. That's where if you create transcripts of media data, that's where the transcripts show up and where you can edit them. That's where you work with text-only data. If you're working with still images or PDFs, they come as a pop-up window because there's some issues with that about the dimensions of the data file that make it not quite fit into this set of connected windows. Then in the lower right-hand corner is the data window. And this is where we interact with Transana. This is where we bring new data into Transana. This is where we let Transana know what data we want to work with on any given day, and a variety of tasks like that. So those are Transana's 4 main windows when we get started. You noticed as the video played, there was a highlight in the transcript that moved along with it. And that's really nice if there's points where there's a lot of overlapping speech, for example. You could tease out who says what in the transcript and separate that out and make it a little bit clearer. But the transcript is also really important for another reason. One of the things that I want to emphasize is that when you're working with media data, the media file is your data. One of the things that I see a lot when I am doing lit reviews is people will say we video recorded or audio recorded interviews, and we transcribed them, and we threw away our media files and analyzed the transcripts. And that makes me nuts, because you lose so much valuable information when you lose your media file. The media file gives you inflection, it gives you tone, it gives you body language, you can see facial expression sometimes. There's a lot of additional information that you get from having a media file that you don't get from a cold transcript. The transcript is an abstraction of your data and has less resolution, less information in it than the media file. So when you're analyzing media, you should be analyzing the media, you should be coding the media, using the transcript as a secondary representation, as a tool to help you do that. One of the ways that a transcript is really helpful is it helps you find what you're looking for. As you scroll back and forth in a file, the images change, but you really can't find the bit that you're looking for very, very well based on the visual of the media file. So I know, for example, that they talk about the word symmetry in this lesson. And if that's what I want to focus on for my analysis, I can find that really easily by typing in part of the word and doing a search on my transcript so that I get to the spot that I want.
And Amanda, while she was listening to the story, said, "What's symmetrical?"
And you can see that I was able to use the transcript to jump immediately to that spot in the video, so I can now begin analyzing my the discussion of symmetry and the work going on in this classroom about all of that, using the transcript as a tool to help me locate the bit that I'm interested in. So that's just a super quick introduction to the layout of the main windows and a little bit about the philosophy of working with media files in Transana. So let's go ahead and bring in fresh data. Let me demonstrate how to do that in Transana. You can see that Transana starts with 4 main sections in the data window. Libraries are where we put raw data. We bring data in and put it in a library. Collections are for analytic data. We find something interesting in our data and we put it into a collection that gives information about what's interesting about that piece of data. So collections are for analysis, whereas libraries are for raw data. Keywords are where we create our coding scheme. You can see I've got a coding scheme established for my sample analyses. It's really quick and easy to do, and I'm really not going to talk about that very much. That one you'll be able to figure out on your own. And then there's search, which in Transana you do searches of the coding that you have or the text in your data or whatever, and the results come up in the search node. They look very similar to what's stored under collection so that you can work with it analytically. But the difference is that a search is temporary, a search is an exploration, and you're able to manipulate things in the search without changing your underlying data as a way of figuring out what is going on with your data, what your data has to tell you. So the first thing that we do in Transana is we create a library to put our data in. So I'm going to create a library. I just right click on libraries. I'm going to choose add library, and I'm just going to call this webinar demo, because the purpose of this data is to demonstrate things during the webinar. Transana doesn't care how you organize your data. If you're doing an analysis in education, for example, you might organize it by school, you might organize it by topic, you might organize it by teacher, you might organize it by classroom. There are lots of different ways you can organize it. Organize it in any way that works for you to be able to find the piece of data that you want to work on in any given day. And that feature is really designed for people who have dozens or hundreds or even thousands of pieces of data that they're working with. Transana is designed to help people with very, very large collections be able to manage that huge amount of data. And that's why the library concept exists. Once I have my library, I right-click it again, and you can see I can add an episode, which is to bring in media-based data, audio or video. I can add text. So if I have Word documents or rich text format or text files, or if I have PDFs, I can bring those in here. I can import spreadsheet data, which is if you've done an online survey, you download that in a spreadsheet form, you can import that. So you can bring in data. So I'm bringing in media data, so I'll choose add episode. I'm going to go out and I'm going to select my demonstration file because that's the file I demonstrate with. And so I've selected that file and I'm going to hit OK. And Transana now asks me to create a transcript because it recognizes it as media data. So I'm just going to call it the demo data. And I want to have Transana do the transcription for me. I want to use a transcript because that is a useful tool during analysis. Now, I don't have to create a transcript. I can work with my video data without a transcript. If I have video of dance or video of instrumental music or something that isn't easy to transcribe, I can work without a transcript and still analyze my data. But since I do have something that can be transcribed here, I'm going to go ahead and have Transana create a transcript for me. Transana actually gives me 3 different tools for that have different advantages and disadvantages. I'm going to choose a tool called Faster Whisper because that's embedded in Transana. That's on my computer. I can get a transcript of this file without having to send the file to somebody else's external server, which my IRB might not approve of, for example. So I'm using the embedded version, the internal version in Transana. And so I'm selecting my automated transcription tool, and we're going to go with that. If I had a transcript that had been done by somebody else, I could import that here and work with that. But in this case, I'm going to ask Transana to create the automated transcript for me. And so Transana is now running its automated transcription tool. Yes, I understand the rules. It pulls the audio out of the video to just focus on that. I can specify what language is my data in. Transana supports about 100 different languages for source data. I can specify the model that I'm using. That's the level of accuracy. The bottom line is that the more precise, the more accurate I want to be, the longer it's going to take Transana to process that data. And so there are trade-offs between speed and accuracy. I'm actually going to choose the most accurate form here, and I'm going to cheat on how long it takes. And then I have a choice of automatically putting in time codes, which are references to that link the transcript and the media file together. I can put those in every sentence or every word, depending on my analytic needs. I'm going to leave that at sentence. If I'm working with data that is in a language other than English, and I'm using the Faster Whisper method, I can ask for a translation of that file to English. So I can get an English transcript of non-English data. I cannot vouch for the quality of that because unfortunately I'm a monolingual American, but that is a feature that is available. And so I've now specified how I want this to work, what my settings are for this, and I'm going to click next. Now that went really fast because I'm cheating. Transana has actually already done the automated transcription, pulled that data for me from this particular file. So it's not having to do this. This will take longer with real data, but nobody wants to sit here and watch the little counter tick across the screen. So I'm cheating. So Transana, this is what Transana returns for an automated transcript. What you can see is it is essentially a rough draft. And it has color coding to indicate the confidence that the automated transcription program had in the transcription that it did. So if something's in red, then there's 70% or lower confidence that the program thinks that word is correct. If something's in blue, it's 80 to 90% confident. Green is 70 to 80%. Black is above 90. That's a guide. I have found words that were absolutely incorrect that the program was very confident about. I found lots of words that were very correct that it had lower confidence about. That's a guide. It's not particularly accurate, but it helps you see where you need to put your attention to. Now, as I've said, this is a rough draft. You should not just jump straight to analysis from an automated transcript. The technology just isn't that good. At its very best with like media data, with advertisements recorded from television, these automated transcription programs can get as high as about 95%. So 19 words out of every 20, it gets correct. With real life data, the numbers come in much, much lower. With classroom data, for example, the best I've seen is about 80% accuracy, 4 out of every 5 words correct, which means 1 out of every 5 words is not correct. But I've also seen transcriptions come in as low as about 60% using some of the faster models. And 60% is really not very good. That means that about 1 out of every 3 words is not transcribed necessarily correctly. So you need to build in the time to go through your transcript pretty quickly and make corrections. So I'm going to, Transana makes that fairly easy. I'm going to pick a sentence. I'm going to play that sentence.
This is the core they started with, and they want it to look like that.
So yes, they had what I thought. So I'm just going to click on the formatting button that indicates that that's all cleared up. And so I can go through.
And up, or looking.
And again, that one is correct. This next one.
Do you think we have to test it on their coursework?
In this case, the word coursework is wrong. That is actually a core square. So I can correct that and then again signal through formatting that I've checked that line. So I'll go through my whole file. I'll correct all of the bits that need to be corrected. And I can typically do that if I have an hour-long data file. I can usually do that in about hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes if I've used one of the better auto transcription models to come up with higher quality. And so it's important to emphasize that there is that step of correcting the transcript. Now, if you don't care, if you're doing quick analysis and you've got a deadline, you're doing market research and your customer wants an initial analysis tomorrow morning, you don't have time to correct the transcript. You go with good enough, obviously, and move on. But if you're doing careful, precise academic analysis, it's worth the time it takes to correct that transcript. It is still faster than doing manual transcription. So we're just going to pretend that I have done all of that. What I'm actually going to do is add another transcript, and I'm going to pull one in. Where'd it go? So I'm going to pull in one that I have already corrected, because again, that's not very interesting to watch. So I now have my finalized transcript that I've corrected. You'll see that I've added in just a little bit of stuff borrowed from conversation analysis to deal with things like overlapping speech.
It goes to the same
Looking
thing.
it up, or looking. Do you think we have to test it on their coursework?
Yeah.
All right. Okay, now,
And so if you're doing conversation analysis, you'll spend more time modifying that transcript than you might if you're using a less transcript dependent methodology. I know there are a couple of you who are doing conversation analysis. So yeah, there's that extra step. If you want specifically Jeffersonian notation, there are some buttons in the transcript toolbar for the symbols that are not readily apparent on your keyboard used in Jeffersonian notation. So rising intonation, falling intonation, audible breath, and whispered speech are the 4 symbols that you can't get on a keyboard. Transana does support those, and you can add those in through conversations, through keyboard shortcuts, or through the buttons in the toolbar. Okay, so any questions about the process of bringing data in or getting your transcript automatically generated? Obviously, you can manually generate transcripts as well from scratch or import them as I demonstrated. Any questions about getting to the point where you're ready to start digging into the data in a more refined way?
Okay, can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
If you have 2 languages, like for example, Polish and English, and there is not much Polish, predominantly it's a recording in English, but occasionally you have Polish words or Polish sentences. How does Transana deal with that? With the foreign language?
Right. The answer is not very well. As a general rule, these automated transcription programs are trained for a single language. They don't deal well with multiple languages. I'm working on some ways to resolve that, but I haven't got anything working yet. So what I suggest at this point is do an automated transcript in English, do a second automated transcript in Polish in your case, and then Transana has a feature that allows you to have multiple transcripts. And so you would have the English version on one side, the Polish version on the other, and then go through and edit those 2 transcripts just to take out the parts that are not correct, or that are in the wrong language, if you will. And so you can actually have this sort of paired transcript where you've got the correct English on one side where they're speaking English, the correct Polish on the other side where they're speaking Polish. It's not a perfect process. I actually did some experiments. My theory was that when an automated transcription program had a word that wasn't in the language it knew, that it would have very low confidence in that. That did not work. In fact, these programs very confidently interpret words that are in the wrong language, and they'll very confidently give you something that's completely incorrect for that. So my hope to be able to cleverly use the confidence ratings as a way of determining which language was correct and then creating a third merged transcript that got all of the languages right was an absolute failure. It was a fun experiment, but it didn't work at all. So at the moment, that's something that a human brain has to do. So if you're doing a lot of stuff with a lot of mixed languages, this 2 transcript approach is most likely what you'll need to do. If you have a lot of English and just a little bit of Polish, then somebody who speaks Polish is just going to need to go in and correct that during the transcript review process.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
And hopefully over the next few years, that's something that automated transcription programs will get better at, but right now they're really bad at it. Any other questions? All right, let's go back to our demonstration data and let's start doing, pick the wrong transcript, of course, and let's start doing some analysis. Now, I'm not doing real analysis here. I'm not actually thinking about this data because I can't present the webinar and do real analysis at the same time. My brain just isn't quite that flexible. So if I do stupid things in the analysis, please ignore that level of things. But I want to come in and I want to code some of my data. I'm going to come down here to an interesting bit of my data, and I'm going to make a selection in my transcript. Let's say that this particular selection I've selected across several times.
It's letting you do everything you guys have been doing,
Except for
diagonal flips.
Okay, so I want to code that. And so I'm going to go to my, and I've already created my coding system. So this is about diagonal flips. So here's my diagonal flips. And I'm just going to double click that keyword. And you can see up in my visualization that there is now this mark here that indicates that a portion of my data has the code diagonal flip on it. so I have now coded this particular section for diagonal flip. And here, this is where the teacher introduces the concept of symmetry. So if I want to code that, I'm going to code that by symmetry, and I'm going to go to teaching techniques, and I believe I have something for introduction of new content. So I've now coded this particular section that I selected in my transcript for two codes, symmetry and teaching techniques, introduction of new concept. So it's really easy to create codes in Transana, and then to apply those codes, it's really just a matter, to apply those codes to media data, it's a matter of making a selection and double clicking the keyword, and that pairs the keyword with the section of code that I've got. And we can see that in the visualization window. So here's something, again, it's about symmetry and okay, I don't have the codes that I'm looking for, but this is a case of misunderstanding. And so we're just going to use refinement to indicate that. So you can see I can go through and I can pretty quickly code my data. I can add codes as I go. Can a specific bit of data be given multiple codes? Yes, absolutely. You'll see that in fact, this small bit right here, if I actually go to that particular bit, I'm going to load that right now. So here is the section that I had.
What else could be symmetrical? What else could be symmetrical?
Carpet.
And we can see if we look at the coding for that, that it has symmetry and refining the two codes that I applied to it. So yes, a single selection can have multiple codes. That's a question that came in through the chat for those of you who don't have the chat window going on.
David, could I ask a question?
Certainly.
Is there any policy about line numbers? I realize this could be typed in manually, but does Transana support line numbers or not support line numbers?
Transana does not support line numbers because line numbers are liars.
Okay.
They are completely unreliable. And so let me actually say a little bit more about that. So what you see over on the left-hand side is actually paragraph numbers in Transana. And the reason for that is that, let's say I wanted to make my media take up less space. Well, suddenly my transcript is wider, and suddenly something that took up 2 lines before now takes up 1 line. Line numbers are not predictable. They're not consistent. They are not reliable as indicators of position. So what I do instead is I use time codes. I've just turned each of these red marks as a time code. A time code links a specific spot in the transcript with a specific spot in the media file. Now, no matter what I do to my transcript, that time is not going to change. So when I turn on the time code values, I can use time code, and that will work 100% of the time, no matter how I edit my transcript, no matter how I change its shape, no matter when I add additional paragraphs, whatever, those time codes don't change. So I use time code, which is a reliable indicator, rather than line number, which is not. I know that that's not the way the rest of the world does it, but that's a system that I found works much better.
Thank you.
Another code, another question in the text. If I double code, will the passage and clip show up for each code when I print the code report? Yes, absolutely. If I put 2 codes on the same selection, then when I do a report that includes describing that selection, both of those codes will show up, unless I've told Transana not to show all of the coding. And if I do a search, whether I search for code A or code B, that clip will be returned for either of those codes. It's only if I search for A and B together that both of those codes would be required, and I wouldn't get, for example, if I required symmetry and introduction, I would get this long section in the middle. I would not get this section over the right, because while it has symmetry, it does not have teaching techniques. So that when I do searches, I can do searches for combinations of codes and include or exclude along that. So the coding is very flexible in that way. So there was something subtle that went on that I don't know if you noticed or not, but what we say is all of those selections that I made and coded actually appear in the collection node as separate items that I can select. So I can select this longer section. I can select that first selection that I made. And you see that I actually have a miniature representation.
It's letting you do everything you guys have been doing,
Except for
diagonal flips.
So when you code something in Transana, you create a virtual clip. You create this selection that gets the coding that is this thing that you can manipulate in the collections window. Now, since I was just coding, just moving through my data, selecting codes and going on, Transana didn't give them very interesting names, which is fine. It didn't need to, because it was just tying the code to the selection. And so one way of approaching analysis in Transana is what we call coding. It's where you make your selections, you double click your codes to apply them, and you move on. And that is, as an analytic method, first off, it's a perfectly legitimate analytic method that people use all the time and do brilliant work with. But as I think about data, that actually divides your analysis into two steps. You apply your coding as a first step as you go through all of your data. And then you have this second step where you look at all of your codes. You look at the reports, you look at the maps and the graphs and the drawings that Transana does, and you figure out what that coding means. That's kind of a first you figure out what codes to apply and where, and then as a second step, you figure out relationships between coding and what it all means and what codes go together and what codes don't and what codes follow each other and all of that. It's a second analytic step. So that process, you code and then you use Transana's reports and maps and graphs and searches to figure out what it means. And then you go on and do your write-up. But there's also another method of working that is actually collection specific. You can create named collections. You can add a collection, give it a name. So I created a collection called argumentation. I was looking at an advertising campaign. I pulled together a whole bunch of ads. I wanted to figure out how this advertising campaign worked, how what the advertising company was doing to separate me from my money in return for a specific product. And so I decided to use what's called a categorization approach to analysis. I did not use coding. I created a category called argumentation. And the first thing I did was I went through a bunch of ads and I created a bunch of clips that were interesting. And I put all of those clips in my argumentation category. And then as I looked at those clips, I figured out that there were two different kinds of clips. There were two different things going on as my first pass through. There was logical argumentation. This product accomplishes this task. It solves this problem. It does this particular thing that you want to do. You know, it was bits of ads designed to appeal to my brain to explain to me logically why I wanted their product. And great, that made a lot of sense to me. That's how my brain works. But there were all these other clips that had nothing to do with logic. You can use our computer on the beach. Well, you know, I am a person of a certain age and I live in the Midwest where we don't really have oceanfront property. And so that one didn't make sense to me, but that was clearly appealing to, you know, all of my friends were jealous because I could use my computer on the beach. It was an emotional argument. That was an argument that didn't specifically address logic, but there was still a reason that some people would purchase that product. All of the cool people use our brand. Everybody's buying our product. There are lots of emotional arguments that can be made, and a lot of advertising is really devoted to emotional arguments that get people to make purchases not based on their brain, but based on emotion. And so as I went through and got more and more examples, there were different logical arguments that were made. There were different emotional argumentation techniques that were made as we went along. I created these subcategories, and I sorted the clips that I was creating into these subcategories. And you can see that my analysis, my understanding of the data as it grew was represented in this collection structure. So theory is represented by a series of collections with specific clips as evidence for the argument behind each of those collections. So it's a slightly different way of doing an analysis. Now, ultimately, putting a clip in a collection that describes what's important about it is the same as applying a tag that describes what is important about a particular selection. It's just a different representation of the same. I'll get to you in just a second, CJ. It's just a different way of representing what is important with slightly different ways of working with the data, slightly different advantages and disadvantages. CJ, you had a question.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just it's related to Nancy's question actually, and it's kind of a operational issue. Is it? I mean, so is it the way that you went about doing that collection building task was making the quick clips, relabeling them, sort of putting them into initial categories that you review, and then sort of create new subcategories for, or go ahead.
Yeah. Absolutely. Transana is designed so that, for example, let's say I want to take these 3 clips, I can move them to a different place. So you can absolutely move things around within the hierarchy using cut and paste, using drag and drop, whatever your preferred methodology is. I find cut and paste works when you have a lot of data and you have to scroll around in the window. Drag and drop becomes a little bit cumbersome. So I use cut and paste mostly, but yeah, you absolutely can. And yes, some people start by creating quick clips, which they then name. This was they name them and they go to a particular collection, and they they create a collection and they move them into that collection. So creating quick clips is one way to do that. There are other people who just create their clips directly. So if I come back and load my video, I can actually make a selection here, and then I can go to my collection and add the clip. And that shows up in my collection there. So I can create clips without doing any coding at all, which is what I just did for this one. I could have added coding during that creation process as well. There was an opportunity to do that. Or you can create quick clips using the coding process and then move them into meaningful categories as you go. And in fact, when I look at the way that I do analysis, when I'm approaching new data, I tend to do a lot of coding because I don't really know where I'm headed yet. And I just find the interesting bits and I put labels on them. Then I study those codes. Gee, I noticed there's a lot of this code is getting used a lot. That's clearly one of the things that's going on in my data that may become a theme. I create a collection for that. I move those codes into that theme. I give them more meaningful names. I may subdivide them as I look at them more closely. So I start with coding to identify what's interesting, but I transition into a categorization methodology later in life so that when it's time for me to do my write-up, I actually have my themes represented as collections. And I can go from one theme to the next. I can see how much data is in each theme by looking at how many examples I have in each. There are notes that you can attach to each collection that explain what the thematic or theoretical implication of that category is. So there are lots of ways to do analytic writing and documentation of your process in your analytic memos. There's ways of recording all of that. And so some people do all coding, some people do all categorization, some people do a hybrid of the two. I tend to do a hybrid of the two, moving from coding to categorization, because that's how my researcher brain works. Not everybody's researcher brain works like mine does. I openly acknowledge that. That's one of the reasons that Transana offers you 2, 3, 4 different ways of doing everything, is because not everybody does things exactly the way I do them. And I want to facilitate lots of different people doing their analytic activities in different ways. But essentially it all boils down to different ways of representing what is important and putting that into your data. Really quick digression here. You can actually create still images. So this is an image captured from a video that I put some coding on. Those lines actually have analytic meaning. So they were talking about symmetry, and the researcher was talking to this one kid, where are the lines of symmetry in this particular pattern? And the kid said, well, there's this vertical one, there's this horizontal one, but there are also diagonal ones. And what I found was that, in fact, this pattern is symmetrical vertically and horizontally. It is not symmetrical diagonally. So this was an indication of where the lesson plan to teach symmetry had succeeded, in terms of the kid was able to identify correct lines of symmetry, but where the curriculum might need some slight adjustment, or maybe they weren't far enough into it, or I don't remember the details of the research, but this indicates some places where the student identified lines of symmetry that in fact were not correct, that were an error, that show that the kid doesn't completely grasp the concept of symmetry yet, or can't apply it completely at this point. And so here's a visual diagram that demonstrates a particular error in thought that was occurring at a particular time. And so I can actually, I created a visual version to capture what that was. And I can actually load the snapshot context. I can go to the specific spot in my video file where that particular snapshot was taken, and I can link that particular image to a particular spot in the video, and it all comes together in a way that is analytically really convenient, and that allows me to do some very nice, sophisticated analytic things with visual aspects of the video data, which is a part of going beyond what a transcript can provide for you. Okay, let me digress again just for a second. If you're working with text-only data, let me see, I think, yeah. Here is an example of a text document, and here's some coding from that text document. So I have coded text and applied keywords to it, and put those text selections into collections as text quotes. So it works the same for text. It's a little bit different for still images. Here is an example of coding an image. You can see that in coding images, you literally draw the codes onto the picture to show particular aspects of coding. So in this case, I noticed that this particular sculpture had 5 legs. And so I marked as legs that are okay, that have a single representation, I marked with green, and the one duplicate leg I marked in red. So I was able to highlight what the difference was that was important about this particular image. I also coded the head, but I can hide that because that's not relevant. And again, Transana gives you a lot of power for manipulating things to make analytic sense out of what you're working on. And I eventually found another example from the same historical period in the same culture that had that same phenomenon of the dual right front legs, and figured out that if you looked at this particular sculpture from different angles, you saw different representations of that leg. And that was clearly a style or an artistic solution to the problem of working in 3 dimensions. That applied to a particular culture at a particular time. So I was able to code that similarly. This image was coded in an older version of Transana that didn't have quite the ability to customize the coding shapes to make them as narrow and as specific as this later version over here. So we code things visually when we're dealing with visual data. If we have PDFs, PDFs go a step further because PDFs are a combination of text and visual. So when working with PDFs in Transana, you can create text selections and you can create graphic selections. So in this case, for this PDF, where I have text selections, I can actually open that coding and select my text selections, and I can look at my graphical selections that show my coding, that show the portion of the PDF that was coded in a particular way. And then when I look at my PDF as a whole, I can see all of the coding that I did on this page. It works with multi-page PDFs as well. So PDFs have this combination of being able to treat the visual aspects as visual and the text aspects as text. So if I do a text search for the word directions, Transana will, from the search, return this particular PDF selection because it's a text selection. Whereas obviously there's no, these two at the bottom are graphical selections, and so Transana does not recognize the text that is within those, and so those don't get returned for text that is contained in them because those were made as graphic selections rather than text selections. So a lot of power to code things exactly the way you think they need to be coded and represent things in the analytic program in ways that make sense. So while I'm showing mostly video in my demonstration today, there are some examples of alternate kinds of data, and Transana works in very, very similar ways with those other kinds of data. So let me now clean out Transana's interface. Does anybody have other questions about the process of coding, of either categorization or coding in terms of making and working with selections of what is analytically meaningful and important about data? Okay, please do raise the question if you have it. Let's now move on to making sense out of data. Transana provides a whole host of reports and maps and graphs and searches that are used in that process of once you got your data in Transana and you've got your transcripts done and corrected, and you've created your selections and you've coded them and you've categorized them, there's this kind of next step of making sense out of the data and moving from digging through the data up to your elbows, looking really closely, to backing off, looking at data more distantly, making connections, and moving on to that theoretical understanding of the data that becomes the paper or book chapter or article or dissertation or book or career that is the goal of doing all of this analysis. And Transana provides lots of different tools for that. And I'm branching out from the demonstration data to broader sample data that I've brought in my database to address some of these questions. So I'm going to look at presidential debates from in the US from 2008, 2012, 2016. And I want to look at, I'm going to pick this one particular debate, and I'm going to look at what words were used during this presidential debate. And so I'm doing a word frequency report. So here, Transana gives me all of the words in this particular debate. It gives me the number of times that word was used. You can see I can actually create word groups. I can take different forms of a word and combine them together where they get treated as a single instance. I can create these word groups. You can actually create synonyms. I was doing a study with medical data at one point, and we created a word group that included doctor and physician and practitioner and surgeon and specialist and a whole bunch of different words that people were using that all were indicators of the physician, the particular individual. And so we combined those together as a word group because the importance of that concept was getting underrepresented because people used lots of different words for it. So you create these word groups. Transana gives you a bunch of tools for identifying alternate word forms and creating those groups. And you can actually, from that, create a word cloud that gives you a visual indication of what words are important. And so one of the things I did with that was I took a look not at the answers, but just the questions that were asked across the course of 3 different election cycles. And I was able to demonstrate through looking at those word clouds that reporters asked different questions in 2016 than they asked in 2008, 2012. The first 2 election cycles I looked at, reporters asked policy questions. There were very few policy questions by 2016. Questions were all about personality and scandal and a whole host of things that had nothing to do with policy. So there was a distinct shift between 2012 and 2016 in the way reporters behaved in the presidential debates. And I am not going to address the 2020 debates, and I think I'm not even going to collect the data for the 2024 debates. I think this data serves me well enough. And so you can use the word frequency counts and the word clouds as a way of getting at what is talked about in the data, what are the words that people use to talk about that, what concepts come through as most important, and you can make sense out of things that way. Transana offers a host of other tools as well. I can take everything I've gathered together into a collection. Let's pick this one, and I can ask for a collection report. This is a text-based report that gives me information about all of the elements that I have gathered together in this particular collection. Transana gives me a list of each item. It tells me where it's from. It tells me what it contains. It tells me what coding I've applied. It gives me the analytic memos that I've attached to each of those items. I can go into the configuration utility and change what elements show, but you'll notice that each clip is a hyperlink. So I can literally, from my report, if I read something and I don't understand why did I code it this particular way, I can load the underlying data and I can watch the video and I can understand exactly what that clip represents. Remember, I talked at the beginning about how your data is your media file. It's not your transcript. If you're in a report that's showing you the transcripts, because that's what's most easy to show, you can always, with just a single click, get back to your media to make sure that you are understanding. Jane, I'll get to your question in just a second. But it keeps you tightly linked to the media data. And so there are these textual reports. Transana also produces visual reports. So I'm going to one of my source files, and I want to look at what coding was shown across this particular file. So I'm going to go to what's called the keyword map. The keyword map is a graphical representation of coding across the timeline of a particular media file. And when I look at this representation, now this is pretty customized. This isn't my raw, this is not all of my coding. This is particular codes that I've selected and I put them in a particular order. But this shows that the data that I was looking at, video gameplay data, occurred in 3 phases. There was this first phase where this one thing was going on. There was a second phase where a second thing was going on in the gameplay. There was a third phase where a third thing was going on. I could not have told you that by watching the video. It was only after I coded it and then arranged my codes in this particular way that I was able to see these 3 phases so clearly. I can take that same data and I can look at a different way that I organized the codes, different set of codes, different organization through this. This is the filter dialog allows me to customize my view of my data. So I've changed to look at a different view now. And this shows me something about the chat that was going on as the video game was being played, where there was this group of people trying really hard to be inappropriate. As soon as you announce to a game room full of adolescent males that you're recording something for a conference, some subset of them will try and become as disgusting as possible to spoil your data. And so that was something that happened, and it's coded, and you can see it faded out over time, but continued to occur across the 26 minutes that I recorded. And there were 2 different responses from other members of the group. One was a simple forward phrase that I will not translate for you that came up frequently, particularly at the beginning. And the other was calling people out for being inappropriate. And why don't you just focus on the game? Why are you putting all of your energy into being obnoxious? And we can look at the interplay between those 3 types of communication and what happened across the timeline. Same data, different coding, different view of that data. Transana gives you a lot of power to create these customized view that represent a theoretical understanding of your data, that represent a particular conclusion that you can draw by looking at particular aspects of your data. Now, the question came in from Nancy a couple of minutes ago. Are you able to organize files into, or no, excuse me, wrong one. Can I print a report by keyword? And the answer is absolutely yes. Transana also includes a search function. And so what we can do is we can search. So let's search for the math concept of pi. What do 3rd graders, because that's the data that I have in this database, what do 3rd graders know about the concept of pi? I've done a search. What Transana returns to me is coded selections in collections, because that's how it represents analytic data. These selections all have that coding applied to it. But I can see by looking at this that what I did was essentially a narrative analysis, and these clips tell the story of what these 3rd graders know about pi. A learning task was defined. The students talk about the results. They say that pi is equal to 3. When pushed, they say it's between 3.1 and 3.2. And then they do 2 presentations to their classmates where they talk about pi as being equal to exactly 3 unless you make a mistake. And I can ask Transana to play all of those clips in order, do a little video presentation of those clips based on that particular search. I can also do a search report. So I can generate a report based on the results of my search. And this is just like those other reports, except that it shows a different set of contents based on the results of the search. You can see, by the way, that my reports give me summary information about what coding fell together, both in terms of the count of codes and the amount of time covered in media files, as well as giving me a bar graph to show me coding frequency for this particular sample. That's all built into Transana's reports. So to answer your question, Nancy, as long as you do a search first for a keyword or a combination of keywords, and that you can then follow that up by doing reports on the search results to get those reports based on a particular keyword or coding or combination of codes. Another question, this is the tool I've used Transana to add line numbers to clips or excerpts. So yes, absolutely. As Brian points out, this is a tool that you can identify particular elements with. You can then create. So I can, for example, create my collection report. I can export that report. I can save it as a Word document, and I can then use Word's tools to add line numbers to it and edit it and do whatever it is that I want to be able to work on that data for external presentation. And so that is very quickly Transana's reports and searches. There's obviously a lot more power built into Transana than that. Transana has the capacity, for example, let me just open up one more sample here. This is one of the most complex analyses that I have done over time. What is this? Okay, I can close that. So this is data where I had two separate videos that I linked together. So you can see that what is shown on the computer screen here is shown full screen here as a screen capture. I created three separate transcripts because that's what it took to be able to understand this very, very fast moving data with really complex audio. And you can see I've done a ton of coding to it and did both coding and categorization to make sense out of this. And so Transana has the capacity to take really, really, really complicated data and allow you to make sense out of it using the tools that I have demonstrated in this webinar. So I have a couple of minutes over time. I'm happy to stay and answer questions as long as people have questions, but that is a very brief introduction to Transana, and I'm happy to expand on anything that people have questions about from this point forward. Thank you very much for coming to the webinar today. I hope that it has answered your questions, shown you a little bit about how Transana works, inspired you with some things that you now want to pursue. Oh, one last thing that I should add is that as you have questions about Transana, which of course you will, you can go to the Transana website. And the Transana website has a huge amount of information. So as a place to start, if you go to Learn Transana and choose the tutorial, and then what version of Transana do you have, and do you want a beginning tutorial or an advanced tutorial? The beginning tutorial just being a shorter version. There's nothing in the standard tutorial that's not also in the advanced, but some people don't want to confuse themselves when they're learning the tool the first time through. So you make those choices, and Transana gives you what is a lot of information about the whole analytic process. And you can see it's divided up. There's some introduction, background information. There's adding source data for text, for still images, for PDFs, for media data, and a lot of variations on media data because media data is more complicated and there are more analytic choices to make. There's transcription that gets its own separate category because there's a lot going on in there. I mentioned in passing that Transana provided 3 different ways of doing automated transcription. If you want to figure out which of those makes sense for you, then go to the automated transcription overview and the 3 detailed pages in the tutorial for more information about that. Preparing for analysis, making selections again for text data, still image data, PDFs, media data, depending on do I have a transcript and do I have multiple transcripts and do I have multiple media files, and then manipulating selections, which is the analytic tasks of moving things around and renaming them and some things like that. Finding meaning across selection, which is Transana's reports. Working with notes, which you can see I'm still working on. I'm still writing that section. Searches, some specific hints about writing up data. You can actually write up the rough draft of your results section inside Transana, including links to bits of data, which is a hugely powerful tool for writing, and then additional miscellaneous topics. So there's actually a huge amount of information in that tutorial, and most of those tutorial pages include video demonstrations. So now I really am done. What questions do you have given everything that I put forth? And I know I'm over, so thank you very much for showing up. If you have to leave, no problem. I'm mostly here to hang out for people who have further questions.
Is there a, I noticed you have quite a bit of different libraries in this copy of Transana. Is there a kind of an optimal or a limit in terms of sort of the functionality of um, uh, project files?
I have not found the upper limit. The upper limit tends to come from two places. First off, there's only so much a human brain can manage in a single project. So people divide stuff up to keep it manageable in their heads. And second off, there's computer capacity that I find that over a certain number of several thousand videos, you run out of hard drive space. And that can be a limiting factor. But I have not found the outer limits to aspects of Transana. I have not found a project that had more data than Transana could manage in its database system. I have not found, I've had people work with 6 to 8 hour long videos, and Transana has managed those just fine, although obviously creating transcripts for those was a lengthy process. I have not found those limits. I will tell you that, for example, if you are, and again, this is based on a specific example, if you are creating a text report that includes more than about 10,000 images, it takes a long time to generate that report. Things get slow as you get into larger numbers, and particularly images in transcripts, which I didn't mention during the webinar, but it's something you can do. You can drop images into your transcripts, but that tends to slow things down. If you put more than about 100 to 150 images in a single transcript, then you start to really notice lag as you're loading that transcript. But it still works. So I have not found upper limits.